Hey friends, welcome back to another video. My name's Lefebvre, and today we are going to be talking about things that I wish I knew before I started with watercolor. Okay, I have to be honest, that title is a little bit deceiving because I don't actually or necessarily wish that I knew these things before I took paint to paper, because a lot of these tips that I'm going to share with you, I learned through the teaching of others, but mostly through practice, failure, and play. So while you may feel like you need to go into watercolor learning all the tips and tricks before you start, hear me while I say that the most important thing you should know before starting is that there is no end game with watercolor. And I think that goes for art in general. There's no end game where you're all of a sudden just good at art and that's it. You don't progress anymore. You're not all of a sudden good enough to paint or good enough to teach or good enough to sell your work, because if that was the case, I wouldn't have made my first tutorial, or I wouldn't have sold my first painting to that neighbor down the street or my family friend, and I wouldn't be where I am today. So as we head into today's video, keep in mind and know that you are good enough to start right now, even before you're armed with all the information on how to be the best artist you can be. And with that said, I am going to give you tips that you do not want to miss, so make sure you watch to the end of the video. Let's jump in and get started. Okay friends, so for my first tip that I want every beginner to know when starting with watercolor is that water is just as much as important of a supply as your paints, as your brush, and as your paper. I want you to think of your water as part of the supplies, because unlike acrylic where you're really using water to rinse your brush off and clean your brushes, water is one of the main, if not the main mediums that is going to make watercolor paint do what it does. It is just as important and as special to this medium as the paper is, and as the paint is, and as the brush is. So I want you to start thinking of your water as a tool rather than something just to rinse your brush off. So with that said, water control is probably the top tip and struggle amongst watercolor artists that there is, especially beginners. The amount of water that you have on your paper, on your brush, and in your paints determines the way your paint is going to flow and where it flows and how dark or light your paint is. So the one thing I want to show you, which I see a lot with beginner artists, is they like to look at their paints, and this is a dried palette, these are not wet. They look at their paints as like this glob of paint that they need to pick up. So I see maybe like a wet brush, but I'll see people really try and pick up as much paint as they can, like it's an acrylic paint. And while this does pick up a lot of paint and can give you some really beautiful deep dark values, that's not the only way to use your paint and water. The beauty of water is that, like I said, it helps with the flow of where your paint goes, but it's also used as a tool to lighten your colors. So rinsing your brush off in your water and using that to move your paint around lightens your colors, but also moves the watercolor. Paint will flow where there is water. That is one thing I want you to keep in mind. So like while you're painting with acrylic, and say maybe you are painting, a face, and you lay down the face, a lot of the times acrylic dries pretty fast that you could start painting the eyes and everything over top if you're trying to get those detailed lines. With watercolor, you can't, because in order for you to get detailed lines on top of another color, you need to wait for it to dry in order to get those sharper lines. Because what watercolor does, like I said, the paint will flow wherever it is wet. So if this whole area is wet, I'm going to show you the darker color. It is going to move and spread. It's not going to be this tiny little dot that you would get if it was dry, like so. It explodes and moves. Now actually here, because of the paper I'm using, this part is already dry, so I can get some detailed lines. Well, not completely dry, a little bit dry, which is another kind of technique and stuff that I mention in a lot of other videos. But when the paint is dry, you can get those sharper lines and details, but while it's wet, you're gonna get these bigger kind of blooms. So you need to know that when your paint is wet and your paper is wet, paint will flow through it. Now, in order to control how much water you have on your brush or in your paint, you need to start taking notice of your supplies. So one of the things to notice is looking at your brush. If you have a brush that is sopping wet and you see that there's drips, I don't know if you can't really see it here. There's drips kind of falling off of it. Your brush is carrying a lot of water and it is very wet. So you're gonna get bigger blooms, bigger spreading kind of areas. If you want to cover a big area with watercolor, you want a lot of water. Okay, so let me just show you. I have tons of water on my brush. This is a size 8, kind of a medium-sized brush. You want a lot of water. If you do not have enough water on your brush and you go in with paint, you're not going to be able to cover as much area. You actually get this dry brush effect. So more water helps it to spread to more areas. Less water does not spread as far and you can't cover as much ground. So taking notice of actually looking at your supplies, looking at your brush, like right now I can see there's nothing dripping off my brush. To touch it, it feels a little bit damp, but it doesn't feel like it's wet. So taking notice of these things are really going to help you with your water control while you're trying to achieve paintings. One other thing to do, if you find you are a person who picks up a lot of water just naturally, and you're having trouble where you just always seem to have too much water on your brush and it's just taking over your paintings and you're just like, why am I getting these big blooms? A rule of thumb to kind of control your water and how much you have on it, when you pick up your paint, take your paper towel, which is another essential supply with your watercolor, and just gently tap it on your brush or on your paper towel to take off some of that excess water so you have less of paint. You have less paint and water on your brush, and that helps with your water control a little bit. But my biggest tip for water control is to start taking notice of your brush and your supplies. That also includes your paint. A lot of the time I will wet up my paints before I start painting, so I will actually create a little puddle in my well or in my mixing wells here that keeps it nice and wet, so I don't need as much water on my brush. I would tap it on my paper towel and use the wetness of whatever's in the well already to start painting. But these are all things that you need to take notice of. The second tip I want to talk about that also pertains to water is that in watercolor, in order to lighten your colors, you don't add white paint. Traditionally, you can add white paint. They do make white watercolors, but traditionally, in order to get a light value, or a light wash, like I like to call it, of a color, you add more water. So see here, I had this really dark value of blue. If I wanted to lighten this up, what I would do is I would rinse off my brush, run it against the side just to control that water a bit more, even tap it on my paper towel, and I have a lighter value of blue that is still nice and transparent. Now, if you don't want to do it in that method, you could always put your blue in your mixing well and then add water to it there to get it nice and light. Again, to help with our water control, I would tap my brush on my paper towel so I don't have a sopping wet brush and I'm picking up a lot of water here. I could just pick up a tiny bit. And there I'll also get a light value or a light wash of my watercolor. So in watercolor, if you want to lighten your colors, yes, you can use white paint. People do it, but traditionally you want to maintain that transparency of your watercolor, so you will just add water. My second important tip, especially for beginners, is that paper is a really important supply to get certain looks to your paintings that you desire. Now, I find nowadays a lot of people who are learning watercolor are coming to YouTube and following painting tutorials. Now, I like to say there are two types of videos, well, more than two types, but two main types. There are technique videos and then there are painting videos. Techniques are kind of showing you this stuff of what watercolor can do, how to manipulate it, and then there are other videos where you're learning to paint an actual subject, like a flower or a landscape. I love those videos, but the problem with following a tutorial where you are painting an actual subject without knowing the techniques is that your outcome will most likely, especially if you're a beginner, not turn out to look anything like the tutorial. And that's where a lot of beginners become really disappointed with their work in watercolor and they give up. They're like, why would I try? I clearly have no artistic background or talent. I can't make it look like the tutorial. I'm going to give up. So the problem with that is that there are so many basics of what you need to know in order to get to those paintings. So I suggest for beginners to not actually follow painting tutorials just yet. You can, but just understand that it might not look the same way as the artist. For one reason, just not knowing the techniques. But the second reason is your supplies. Your supplies may be completely different than what the instructor is showing you. And a main supply that really makes a difference is paper. So right now on this paper, I am using this Canson XL watercolor paper. This is what I originally started with, and it's not a bad paper. I do like it. It's cold pressed. It's nice and thick, 140 pounds, 300 GSM. The only thing is that it's not 100% cotton. So getting really nice seamless blends that you can get with a 100% cotton paper is very different. It is a lot harder to achieve seamless blends, like flat washes, with this paper with beginner skills than it is with cotton paper. So you might try a tutorial by someone and you're doing a painting and it looks nothing like theirs, but you also aren't using 100% cotton paper. So you think it's your fault that you did something wrong when really it most likely might be your supplies or lack of knowledge with techniques. So I just want to show you an example. Here I have, I believe this is Saunders Waterford paper. This is rough though, I think, but it's 100% cotton. And I don't know if you can tell, it has texture to it. See how it's kind of grainy? Now this cotton textured paper really helps to soak in watercolor and pigment, and it stays wet a lot longer. So in those paintings where you're doing landscapes and you are applying all these different washes of color, if your paper dries too fast, you're not going to get those seamless blends that you would with a cotton paper. So you might get a little bit disappointed by your outcome. But a cotton paper is a really good option. That is not to say that you need to go out and buy cotton paper. It can be pretty pricey. This is what I started out with. This is perfectly fine, and you can get beautiful results with cheaper paper. But I just want to quickly show you the difference. Now, I have been doing this for a long time, so I know how to manipulate this paper to do what I want it to. So I might show you my example and it might not completely work, but we're going to give it a try. So say I'm doing a pink flower here. Now, what I notice with this kind of paper is that it doesn't take the pigment as well. It's a little bit lighter. The paint and the water kind of glide across and sit on top rather than soaking into it. So it moves around a lot more, and it also dries really, really fast. Okay. Now, what you also might notice when you're doing this, if you are having trouble with water control, when you're using too much water, and you have a paper like this, the water that sits on top, if there is an unevenness with the amount of water in the subject, so right here, I don't know if you can see, I have a pool of water, and then here it's a bit more flat. That's going to dry at a different rate and give you these kind of funky bloom marks, which aren't a bad thing, but some people, if you're following a tutorial and they have this seamless kind of flat wash, you're going to be like, why does mine not look like that? Mine doesn't look the same. So it can be quite frustrating. And then this one, I actually need a lot more water. I don't know if you can see the difference on how pigmented the colors look on here, but it's also a lot more rough. So the watercolor seeps into the paper and it sits there, and it dries at a much slower rate than here. This part is already dry. I don't know if you can tell. This petal is already dry and there's still a pool here. So that is going to create those marks like I was telling you, but it can create a little bit of frustration when you're like, well, why is this dry and why is this not? Why is it making these marks? This is all still wet. It is all the same amount of wetness because of that cotton paper. Okay, and I'm just adding more water onto my brush. You can kind of see the texture through this one. Now, the benefit of having a cotton paper and having it stay wet longer is that you can manipulate your colors and your paper and your painting for a longer time. So if you want to adjust things, it dries slower, you can make those changes. So maybe I want to darken some areas here, add some color where it bleeds nicely. But if I do it here, it's wet there, it's bleeding nicely, but over here it started to dry, you get these sharp lines. You have to work a lot quicker on this paper, which can be a little bit frustrating. Also, fixing mistakes on paper is a lot easier when paper is still wet. So if I want to, kind of eliminate a petal here, while it's still wet, I can lift watercolor. But over here, I can only lift the wet stuff. And so that is going to be a lot harder to work on if it's drying at a different rate. Okay? So it can just be a little bit frustrating. I find it's a lot more forgiving when you have better quality paper to work on. Okay, but see already the difference in the vibrancy of the color. This is so much more vibrant, and this dries a lot lighter and a bit more washed out. And again, I don't want to deter you from using paper like this. I'm actually going to be doing a video soon on using paper like this and the benefits. So don't throw this paper out and feel like you have to go out and get really expensive paper. You don't. You just have to learn how to manipulate it in a different way. Now, with this, you can... One thing I love about watercolor, my next tip, is that it's very forgiving. A lot of people think that if you make a mistake, that's it, end game. See how I have this very sharp line here from the way it dried? You can go back over top, kind of blend it all together. And the key with this kind of paper specifically is you want it to all dry at the same rate so you don't get those weird marks, and that has to go back to water control. So you don't want too much water where you're going to be creating those pools. So wet it all up evenly. Then you can go back in with just paint, add some on top to create those darker blooms, and you can get a similar look to your cotton paper. So one of the things I've heard people say is, I wish I knew that I needed better paper before I started with watercolor. I disagree with that. I think you just need to know how to manipulate this paper and know that it will not turn out or look the exact same as a cotton paper, or you just might have to work around it differently. So that is my next tip. It is knowing your supplies and the differences of the supplies. But again, you might not know the difference until you actually feel it for yourself and try other paper. So just keep that in mind. Okay, so that's my tip there. My next tip is that with every painting, there are always ugly stages. I kind of wish I had an example. But when you are painting, and until you finish that painting, there is always going to be this awkward, ugly stage where you doubt yourself. And I still, to this day, feel those awkward, ugly stages, and I am constantly wondering if it's going to work out. I was recently doing a Patreon live stream where we painted these figs. I'll show you the finished product. But while I was painting it, in the middle of this, I was going, ooh, I don't know if this is going to work out. It was not looking so great. It was looking all mishmashed. But until I added the detail and finished it, it looked kind of crappy, to be honest. It looked like it was going nowhere. Finish your paintings before you decide whether they are good enough. Because until you finish, you won't know. There is always an awkward stage. Until you add details, especially I want to say with animals, until you add that final little highlight detail in their eyeball, they can look so whack and really frustrate you and think that you're an awful artist, but you're not. You have to finish a painting. So that is my other tip. And I think that is my biggest tip for beginners in this whole video, is that you need to finish your paintings. Then you can make your critiques about them. That's not to say that every finished painting is going to work out, because there are still paintings that I finish and I go, I could have done that better, or I could have changed that, or it could have looked better if I did this, but I won't know until I finish it. And most likely, if you do have a painting that did not turn out even when it was finished, like I said, you're going to learn a lot from it. So keep that in mind. That is my biggest tip. So I'd say that those are my biggest tips of what I want everyone to know before starting with watercolor. But the other thing that I want you to know, which I kind of said at the beginning of the video, is that you are good enough now. If you are just starting and you've been painting for a month or two or a year and you feel like you're not good enough to sell, or you really want to teach, but you don't feel like you're there yet, I'm gonna say you are, because you only get better with practice. If I decided I wasn't good enough to teach watercolor when I first started making YouTube videos, which if you go back to my oldest videos, they're not the best. I have learned so much from then, and I have grown so much as an artist that if I thought that I shouldn't have started teaching then, I wouldn't be where I am today. And you only learn by doing and making mistakes. So I hope that was insightful. I hope that gives you the encouragement that you need and the motivation you need to keep going, because watercolor as a process and something you experience is so incredibly worth the struggle. So if you're worried that your end painting is not going to come out perfect, I don't want you to focus on that end game, that end painting, or whether you're going to be good enough in the end. I want you to focus on the process and what has led up to those moments to get you there, because that is what matters. This is actually probably one of the most therapeutic mediums there is out there, and if you don't enjoy the process, it's not going to be worth it. So I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I hope you learned a lot, and I will see you in our next tutorial. Bye guys.